All right, we are back with the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan, and I'm here and blessed to be here with my part-time co-host for this season, Mitch Salazar. The fifth stop of the 2024 WSL Championship Tour season, the Western Australia Margaret River Pro, has finished with Hawaii's Gabriella Bryan and local boy Jack Robinson taking home the big wins. Now, WA marks the relegation point in the season, so both the men's and women's fields have been sharpened by 1/3. And there are some major names that will not be on the CT for the back half of the season, including 11-time world champion Kelly Slater, who has more or less wrapped up a 35-year stint of full-time CT competition, which is remarkable. We have the 2024 WSL Challenger Series season commencing this weekend with the Bonsoit Gold Coast Pro, and I think this year's CS field is going to be insane. In short, there's a ton happening, so let's get to it. Mitch, how are you feeling post-Margaret River, pre-Gold Coast, pre-Tahiti? There's so much going on. How are you feeling about it all?
Well, to say that it wasn't a crazy event would be a lie, and a lot of ups and downs, obviously. Real bittersweet moment right there when Sam had to defeat Miguel in a really close heat, too. And then eventually Miguel, got off tour, but then Sam had to face John Florence, who statistically is the best surfer there all time. He had a good battle, but John just posted up a couple excellent numbers and wasn't able to make it through. So both Pupo brothers relegated to the Challenger Series once again. Good thing for Sam, he did win 2 events last year, including the one on the Gold Coast to start the 2023 CS season. Slater, that's one conversation that I think we already had on the broadcast. And, I through our text group on WhatsApp, seeing that video after the interview to me was the best part. Just the best moments of his career, a really good dedication to Kelly and what he's accomplished so far, and really what he's brought to the tour. I think that's the most important thing. If it weren't for Kelly, we wouldn't have the overlapping format. He's really accomplished a lot within the sport and outside of it too, and he's brought more eyes to the public. So, big props to Kelly. Another great career, but I love that Jesse went on the broadcast and said that the 2 wildcards are there available for him if he would like them for both Fiji and Tahiti. I think that he's probably going to compete there. They're 2 of his best locations. I don't see why not. But overall, I think this was a great event. But bummer to see a few faces go by, especially, a couple of great surfers who had consistent years, the 2 previous, Caio Belli being one of them. He just came off to a slow start. Ended up getting 2 decent results in Bells and here at Margaret River. But on the women's side, Lakey Peterson, longtime CT surfer, she's off. That was a major surprise. And, of course, Sally Fitzgibbons, 2 years back-to-back where she can't make the cut, Dave.
Totally. And, relegation was such a huge theme in WA. But just as you've highlighted, it wasn't just, it's all, rookies or young surfers, or it's all that. It's such a diverse range of surfers, everyone from, rookies coming on to arguably surfers in their prime, surfing their best, world title contenders over the last couple of years, people like Lakey, people like Sally, to 11-time world champions. So a lot happened in WA, but let's get to our opening segment, Mitch, which is winners and losers. We'll start with the bad, then we'll get to the good. So who is your first loser coming from the Western Australia Margaret River Pro?
Well, you touched on this point at Bells, and I have to touch on it here. To me, it's the waiting period that we have right now just after Easter. I'm still not a huge fan of it. I just think it's in between seasons. You either have to do it earlier in the season or a little bit later to me. I mean, as you saw, both Bells and Margaret's, we were running literally till the last few days of the events. And we got very fortunate that we had great waves during the last day of the waiting period here at Margaret River. I mean, to be able to run overlapping heats, I had never seen it before. I had never worked a broadcast before where we ran overlapping heats in the quarterfinals. And, it was amazing that we were able to pull it off, and we were just really blessed and grateful to have excellent waves on finals day. I mean, look at the heat totals. They were amazing. But we don't want to be able to do that. I mean, it shouldn't be every event that we have to wait until the last day to finish the event. And, props to both the broadcast and tours and competitions. They pulled it off, but also to the surfers to have to wait around so long to be able to compete. That's a long time to wait, especially if you're Seth Moniz and other people like Sawyer Lindblad who are waiting for waves in order to get a heat to make the cut, Dave.
I know, and the temptation of all the beautiful attractions in Western Australia, right? Wineries and good food, and you have to stay competitively sharp. But Yes, Easter was on my list too. Let's come off the top rope one more time and dunk on Easter. But, we said this the last time we spoke. Traditions are fantastic. Easter at Bells, very special time. But it moving around the calendar every year is not only a scheduling pain in the ass, but as you pointed out, really has the potential to compromise wave quality, not just for Bells, which we saw, but also for other events as well. And we all experienced it as fans, but word on the ground in WA is that this was one of the slowest event windows seen for waves in recent memory. Even the free surfing was anemic due to lack of swell. Fortunately for us, finals day pumped and was incredible, but we also are talking about 10, 14 days later than day one. To your point, moving it back a few weeks and moving it out of that weird sort of purgatory in between seasons. Look, forecasting's not an exact science. Everything's difficult, but we seem to get better waves the later we go. And later Bells in WA are typically better for waves. So Easter's my first loser again, and I promise I'll leave it alone next time we talk. Well, who's your second loser, mate?
Look, just to finish that point up, wouldn't you rather see 4 or 5 days where it's 4 feet but consistent the entire time, rather than have 3 days where it's 3 to 4 feet, super inconsistent, people have their careers on the line, and then one excellent finals day? Like, no, you want to see the world's best surfers at least have a chance to prove that they deserve to be there. And, I just feel for the surfers being a next competitor. Like, you got into a heat, it's 30, 45 minutes, regardless of the amount of time. You want to be able to catch at least 2 good waves in order to prove yourself to be there. And, it is what it is. It's the nature of our sport. So if you don't comprehend that, though, going into the championship tour, then maybe you don't deserve to be there, though. I will say that. My second loser, Isabella Nichols. She's a former champion here, waited a really long time. I mean, this heat we had a couple of restarts against Gabriella Bryan. Another thing, too, you've been on the QS, you've won QS events, you won Challenger Series events. I know Gabby is a tactical competitor. She's great. I mean, she just got her first win in amazing waves. You can't wait around that long, though. There were plenty of waves on the inside. I'm not saying they're quality waves, but there are at least chances. And you need to be able to pull the trigger in a moment where your career's on the line. Both of them needed to make that heat to be able to maintain their spot on the championship tour. I just didn't see enough energy from her. She came in, she was talking to her coach, Kurt Jacobs, hey, lack of waves. But guess what? Everybody else has the same playing field. So you should be able to move around and at least catch a couple of scores in the mid-range to be able to put up a few numbers, put yourself in number one in the heat, and then eventually apply pressure. On the other hand, Gabriella Bryan, I mean, she implemented that tactic from the beginning of the heat, and it just seemed like Bella, who only caught one wave in the heat 2, Dave, was kind of flustered from get-go and was never able to get going. So unfortunately, she's relegated to the CS. Luckily for her, she did have major success there last year. She won the event in Sydney. I think she's going to have another good season on the Challenger Series.
And as you pointed out, those restarts at any venue, but particularly at a venue like Margaret River with everything on the line, are a psychological plague, right? Like, you don't know what wave to eventually paddle for when you're like, oh, okay, do we have to get going here? I've got to put something on the board. And if I do, is that set that was eventually going to come when I'm on the inside?
Exactly.
It's tough. And Isabel is such a good surfer. I'm sure that's not the last we'll see of her. But on the topic of good surfers, my second loser, and you touched on this a little bit already, but fans of the Pupo brothers, myself included. We are both goofy footers, but as fellow goofy footers, I personally have been a personal fan of Miguel surfing since he burst onto the scene with a prime win at the lower trestles in 2011. I mean, the guy is stylish. He charges. He's got just a rad approach to surfing that's different and high level. He got his first CT win of his career in Tahiti in 2022 after a decade on tour. And these last 2 years, I really had him marked for big seasons, especially in 2024. In the off season, he signed with JS, and I just thought he was going to be in the mix, but the results didn't come his way in the first 5 events, nor did they for his younger brother, Samuel, who has had, let's face it, like more than a few flashes of brilliance over the past year and a half. They had to face each other in the round of 16, both needing results. If Miguel had won that heat, he'd have been safe. He didn't win. Samuel won. Samuel needed to win another heat, but he went down swinging to John in the quarterfinals. So now both of them are back on the Challenger Series, which is a bummer for fans of their surfing on the CT, like myself. But similar to Isabella, I think they have so much left in the tank. So I think we're going to get to see them real soon.
We are, and I thought Sam had a couple of great heats towards the end of the year. I mean, Bells, that carbon board that he had from Jason Stevenson looked incredible at Winky. Just wasn't able to make it into finals day. Here, round of 16 loss to the best guy out there at Margaret River, John Florence. I mean, there's no shame in that loss, but unfortunately for him, that was the heat that he needed to make. I mean, the
Surfed
emotional.
well too.
Yeah, no, he truly did. I mean, posted a couple sevens, and it's not like he didn't try. You know, he went out there and gave his best. It was overlapping heats, though. You have to deal with the heat that's already in the water. Then eventually they get to you. He really only had a 20-minute heat with priority. So, you know, bummed to see both Sam and Miguel. And at this point, too, want to point out Miguel's in his early to mid-30s. How long is he going to be doing this? Even though he did finish number 6 in the world at the end of 2022, had the major injury last year, and then didn't get off to a good start this year. To me, he's accomplished enough to be able to call it a career if he would like to. I do think that we're going to see him on both the Challenger Series and the Regional QS just to be able to fuel the fire a bit more. But if he were to say, hey, I'm done, I'm good with what I'm doing, dude, you've had an incredible career. I mean, spanning more than a decade, both on and off the championship tour. As he mentioned, that victory at Lowers during the Nike 6.0 event, Coldwater Classic champion in Tahiti for your first event win, number 6 in the world in 2022. I mean, you've had an incredibly successful career. And let's talk about the Brazilian Storm of that era, too. He was the one guy that never had the kind of standout moment until a few years ago. So props to Miguel. Big fan of his, and another goofy footer, too. And to get to that, my third loser, and this is an interesting one because I thought we were seeing a great rookie class, and I thought that we had some shining moments. But to me, it's a lack of experience from the rookies on the championship tour. Jacob Wilcox had more than a dozen events surfed as a wild card, had great moments of brilliance here at home in MR, wasn't able to pull it off, though, needed one more wave to dispatch Liam O'Brien, who's had a successful year. Eli Hanneman wasn't able to break it into the round of 16 at any point of the 5 events. Caden Matson was really close. He lost a heartbreaker to Italo, but I just think it was the decision-making for a lot of these surfers, including Alyssa Spencer, too, who weren't able to pull the trigger in moments that were imperative for them to do so in crucial heats. Especially here in MR, Alyssa also surfing against Molly Picklum, had a tough heat, but same thing, was doing well until she just thought she was winning the heat comfortably, left the door open, and eventually Molly Picklum, who's one of the most successful surfers in the world right now, caught up to her, Dave.
It's a great one, and kind of related to my third loser. Oh, mine's a little bit more transitional out of that. But for my third loser coming out of WA, I'm going to be blanketing all the regional qualifiers for this year's Challenger Series because I think the class of surfers who are relegated in WA to the CS are some of the more motivated, talented, and dangerous surfers we've seen in recent memory. We talked about the Pupo brothers, Frederica Moraes, Ian Gentile, Cade Matson, Eli Hanneman, Kyle Belly, Jacob Wilcox, Callum Robson, Isabella Nichols, David Silva, Lakey Peterson, Alyssa Spencer, Luana Silva, Sally Fitzgibbons, India Robinson, Sophie McCulloch, and even 11-time world champion Kelly Slater has hinted at taking a look at the Snapper Challenger event. So awesome for surf fans, but this is a hungry class of CT hitters that are going to be out for blood on this year's Challenger Series season. I think the regional QS surfers are going to have a battle on their hands. Again, great for us, but if I'm coming up from any of the regions and I'm like, who am I drawing in this heat? Oh, like a hyper-motivated Jacob Wilcox or a hyper-motivated, Lakey Peterson? Geez, like it'll be really interesting to see if that performance divide between the QS and the CT and the QS and the CS really, really displays itself on the Challenger Series this year. I'm really interested to see at these first few events.
Yeah, and to point out, as CSO, every surfer on the championship tour that got relegated to the Challengers, they get a seed into every single Challenger Series event for the rest of the year, correct? So, I mean, that's a field that I'm looking at. I'm like, damn, like you go to Saquarema, CT experience for a lot of people over there. You go to Snapper, Lakey's done well there before. Watch out, people.
Totally. And I think that's kind of one of the real benefits. And we've seen it play out, right? Where since the redesign, if you fall off of the CT, it's not a whole year on the qualifying system to get back on. You can be back on before the next season starts, right? So all these CT surfers that were relegated to Challenger Series, if they perform well enough, they could be back on the CT at Pipe in 2025.
Yeah.
And we've seen it in the past. We've seen it with Brisa Hennessy, with Zhao Xianka, with Molly Picklum, surfers who were relegated down a tier and came back and were so much better, winning events, making the final five. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out in 2024.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And, going into our winners now, I just want to say what we saw from Finals Day, especially on the women's side, was nothing short of incredible. My first winner, they're the women's finalist. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Story Lindblad. I've seen her grow up here in Southern California. And for the 18-year-old to post the highest score of the women's event, a 9.4 in the semifinals, and secure her spot on the championship tour for both the rest of the year and the first 5 events of 2025, it was pretty surreal. I was hoping that she put up a bigger battle in the final. She wasn't really able to get the waves that steepened up for her on the backhand. But then Gabriela Bryan, my goodness. She is a competitive machine, Dave. I can tell you that. She went out there with a plan every single heat, and she looked dominant. And, really appreciative of Gabriela, too, because as a power surfer myself, it was really nice to see that on display in real waves on Finals Day, too. She makes the quarters, secures her spot on the championship tour. Into the semis, she looked great again, but I felt like she left her best surfing for the final. I mean, dropped a couple of bombs right there. Surfed a wave with the Dolphins, too, in the final. That was pretty awesome. And then being able to call that moment for Gabby, her second final, her first major victory, both of them here in Margaret River. And now she catapults herself into top 5 right now. Now she just needs to prove that she's able to maintain that spot and eventually compete for the championship at the end of the year.
It's a great one. And my first winner from WA is related, but it's actually the unofficial lineup podcast surf team of Gabriela Bryan, George Pitar, and we'll count him. He's a friend of the podcast, Jack Robinson. Yeah. And of course, I'm being a little bit silly here, but Mitch, you and I have been praising, let's face it, the relatively unheralded abilities of Gabriela and George for a while now. And I dare say we had a little Nostradamus action going on with our foresight here. Gabby not only elevated herself above the cut line in WA, but won her first CT event and made, as you said, global news with her finals wave vision of surfing with a pod of dolphins. And George, who we started talking about after last year's Challenger Series event at Snapper Rocks, showed impressive in and out of the water form at Bells. But my God, he went ballistic in Margaret River. He takes down Cole Hauschman in the round of 32, Liam O'Brien in the round of 16, tour frontrunner Griffin Colapinto in the quarterfinals, and he comported himself very well against a god-tier John Florence in the semifinals. So big lineup podcast, unofficial surf team energy this year on tour so far. And so that's my first winner out of WA.
And I do want to point out, George Pitar requalified through the Challenger Series last year. He didn't have to surf the regional QS because 11 through 20 on the men's side on the Challenger Series automatically qualify. Snapper Rocks is a great event, especially with him being on the heater that he's on right now. And if you look at his past results on the CS last year, 5th place over at the U.S. Open. He's a great beach break surfer too. And I think the biggest part about everything, he's only 21 years old. So he has a lot to improve on. But I think experience is really it's been noticeable, his development throughout the last 2 events. I love the way he competed at Bells against Ethan, no fear, and then here in Margaret River, especially with huge conditions on Finals Day too. To me, he proved himself. I like to see that from George Pitar. And, going into my second winner, to me, it's the boys from the Hawaiian Islands, Seth Moniz, Imai Kalani DeVault. Huge fans of both of them, good friends with both Imai and Seth. But seeing Seth have to potentially surf 4 heats on Finals Day, to me, was like a big task. I was like, damn, dude, you make it into the final. Like, you might have to surf 4 heats of at least 30 to 35 minutes each. Like, that's a lot of stress on your body. It's a great amount of mental fatigue, too. He composed himself, though, dude. Paddles out against Ethan Ewing with his career on the line, gets his best result of the year, makes it into the quarters, defeats Jordy Smith, who had switched the heat at the end of it, and then gets a wave in the last few seconds of that quarterfinal, beats him, and then eventually loses to champion of the event, Jack Robinson, in the semis. Huge fan of Seth. Really excited that we get to see him in Tahiti as the next event, too. He's made it into the semis there before. I think it's going to be a good back end of the year for the young Hawaiian surfer. On the other hand, Imai DeVault, I mean, dude, around a 16 heat against Jake Marshall, an 8.83 for the best score of the heat. he laid it all on the line, and he truly proved that when the waves get to a certain point, he's one to watch out for. When he made it onto the championship tour, a few years ago, I was excited to see him compete. But one thing again, lack of experience in the first 5 events. You're going up against guys who have been to those venues multiple times. It was tough for him to adjust, especially coming from the Challenger Series. But now, second year on tour, you open up with a good result at Pipe, 5th place finish over there. Next thing you know, you're right on the cusp. He qualified a few days ago, so the pressure wasn't really on him on finals day. But he still had more to prove. I mean, because those are his waves where he really shines. We've seen it at Haleiwa, at Sunset, and now we saw it at Margaret River. I think both Punta Roca. I think Brazil is going to be a great event for him too. But watch out for his backhand barrel riding. He's going to do great in both Tahiti and Fiji.
Those are great ones. I think the emotion on Seth's face when he came in from beating Ethan and knowing that he'd made the cut, it was pretty special. Like, he was pretty emotional and fired up in the post-win interview there. And yeah, and I think that's part of it. I know the cut is super duper hard, right? Especially if you're a competitor. And the reality is, I think what we've seen over the last few years is that you are getting a lot of dramatic moments, yes, but the surfing is better than it's ever been. The surfers are motivated from the very first event through every round. They know how important every wave is. And there's really no comparison. When you look back at kind of maybe a little bit of lackadaisical approach to surfing, if you weren't motivated for whatever reason through the middle of the season because you knew you had a whole year, It just doesn't exist anymore. And Imai is such a good one to list as well. And I want to get your take on this too, because astute followers of the tour will obviously look at the rankings, they'll look at the results, they'll follow who's winning and who's in the title hunt, etc. But if they're reading interviews or watching videos on, Stab or Surfline or Inertia or whatever, occasionally they will get this theme that emerges amongst the CT class of who is your favorite surfer. Now, a few years ago, you would hear, oh, Ethan Ewing's my favorite surfer on tour. This was even before Ethan was getting results. Imai is one of those surfers whose name continues to pop up by both the men and women on tour. But who's one of your favorite surfers on tour? That they love Imai's approach. He's got a very cool style. He's super powerful. The results haven't hit in the same way as an Ethan Ewing yet, but they didn't hit for Ethan when he was younger either. So Imai, to me, is one of those really special surfers, and I could see the results coming because you notice that there is almost an unspoken respect on the CT of someone like him.
I think it's an excellent point. And, when I first met Imai, it must have been around 12 years ago, I would say. There's this event in Haleiwa called Haleiwa International Open, the HIO. It's usually for locals only. They also have a Japanese division, which Jason Shiwata usually puts on. There was a final, Kalani David, Cody Robinson, who's the older brother of India, Seth Moniz, and Imai. And, dude, it was firing Haleiwa. I was really looking forward to competing in the final. Eventually, I lost a few rounds earlier. I'm not going to go deep into that because I'm a little bummed that I wasn't able to surf firing Haleiwa the last day. But Imai dropped a couple of hammers in the final against guys that are world class. I mean, one of them is on the championship tour right now. From that moment forward, I kept my eye on him. Backdoor, Pipe. Remember, he won the trials at Pipe a few years ago. Did well in the event, too. Had a 9 and an 8 in one heat, I remember. Then he fast forward, 2021, he makes it onto the championship tour. But it's always been his free surfing ability combined with his competitive strategy that's really been his forte. And I think that's what he brings to the championship tour. That's why Jack Robinson, to me, is so successful right now, because he kind of brings that same spark and that free surf ability to a jersey. John Florence has the same thing. And if Imai is just able to kind of keep his composure in those major heats, he's a top 5 surfer eventually. I mean, he's number 11 right now. He matches his best result on the championship tour as of the year. And I think if you look at the way he approaches the lineup too, there's just certain lines that he picks that not many other people do. And he has a lot of creativity, but most importantly, no fear. So when it gets bigger, Imai's one of the guys that you want to count on, Dave. Who's your second favorite, by the way? Have you
great insights. Yeah. No, we're gonna have we're doing like a trial run for Imai joining the unofficial surf team for the lineup.
He
podcast.
will,
but I'm come on the pod. I'm into it. He's one of my favorite surfers too. But my second winner out of the Western Australian Margaret River Pro stands of John Florence, the Paizel Ghost, and Margaret River Main Break. In 2017, John effectively shifted the collective understanding of how hard you can push and how well you can surf Main Break Margaret River. And I'm sure we'll get to the Paizel Ghost of it all in the next section on the Vissla CT Shaper rankings. But for John in 2024, a 17.13 against David Silva in the round of 32. He edges out Gabriel Medina in the round of 16. 16.26 in the quarterfinals, 18.4 in the semifinals, and 16.04 in the finals, which was admittedly not enough for Jack Robinson, but still, the surfing John does there, I honestly cannot think of another venue on tour in the last 5 years where a single surfer has such a performance advantage at a certain venue. And like, we're going to say, like Kelly at Pipe or John at Pipe, but that's the point. It's not just one surfer at Pipe or one surfer in Tahiti or one surfer at Bells, where even if John's not winning, CT events are very difficult. The CT class has potential winners literally across the draw. But the surfing he does year after year out there, he's always just the number one favorite. To be like, yeah, of course. Like, is there another surfer wave combo on tour for you, Mitch, that is at that level or even approaching that level right now?
No, I mean, you put them out there. John at Pipe, Gabe at Tahiti, Kelly at Pipe, and maybe Fiji too. But you want to know the exact numbers, Dave, coming into the event? He's already had multiple 10-point rides here, but his average heat score coming into the event, it's elevated now. Was a 16-point heat total. Excellent heat total. For John Florence in the history of his competitive career here in Margaret River. He was winning 83% of his heats. He had 44 excellent waves, and that has catapulted even larger with the end of this event. I know he ended up
with a crappy forecast.
Yeah,
like his like one of the crappier forecasts we've had. Great finals day, we've already said it, but in recent memory at Margaret River, and his heat average went up.
Yes,
like that's crazy.
I know. I'm trying not to curse right now because this is like watching it live, especially the semi, dude. That 10, like, I don't comprehend. Like, he does a deep bottom turn. The wave's huge, by the way. Does a deep bottom turn, does a clay back on that first section, and then fits in another 2 great maneuvers afterwards. Like, you could just retire happily after that wave alone. Like, I would be cool with just having one of those waves in my life. But the guy's a phenomenon. I mean, he's a freak. He's literally... I would say outside of Kelly, Gabe, and Andy, he's the most complete surfer we've ever had in the history of the sport of surfing. I mean, who can do it in 2 feet all the way to 60 feet? Like, if the guy wanted to pursue just big wave surfing alone, he could probably win the world championship over there too, Dave.
It's a great one. Well, we're going to talk about John more later in the year, I'm sure. But who's your third winner coming out of Margaret River, Mitch?
So this is going to come to a surprise to most of our listeners, but... as we said in our previous episode, Dave, our winners and losers don't necessarily have to have had either poor events or great events. And my winner, I would even put him up at number 1, is Iago Doro. He's number 22 in the ratings. The guy just barely qualified. He lost out in the elimination round, so we didn't even see him after that. But the fact that we are able to see Iago compete on the back end of the year in the first 5 events of 2025, to me, is a pleasure. Because, first of all, another goofy footer. I just think, though, he's so talented, so creative, and he brings certain things to the sport that are necessary at this point, to a free surf kind of advantage to his competitive prowess, but most importantly, just being one of those guys in the elite surfers, by the way, I would say eventually he's going to be able to make it into the top 5 that is just a bit different than everybody else. How many people have you seen do both slobs, stale fishes, corrupt flips in the same event, by the way, have the same success that he's had at the Surf Ranch that he's going to have at Pipeline and Tahiti? Like, to me, this guy is unique. I really want to see him do well in the last 5 events. He's a champion at Saquarema last year. I think that's going to be a good event. But with the addition of Fiji, I think that should be a competitive event for him. To me, he's a finals day surfer. I think the World Tour is better with Iago on it, though. And I'm really pleased to see him qualify. But really, I mean, just barely made it. 22 in the rankings. Samuel Pupo was right there to take a spot.
It's a great one, you know, and I think you pointed it out. Like, in the subconscious, like, I think fans, I know I do, consider Iago like, yeah, he's like a Final 5 contender, of course. And then again, like every heat is a challenge on tour. Everyone is so good. And on finals day, I know you and I and our producer Miguel, we were exchanging messages about like, oh wow, like Iago's in trouble here.
Yeah.
Like, and baffled me that he even was close to the cut line. Huge win, I think, for surfing that he's still on tour. I would imagine that the safety net of going, yep, I'm on tour for the back half of this year. I've already qualified for the start of 2025. Hopefully the results start coming. He could win every event throughout the back half of the year. That's how good he is. And I like what you said. He's got a really unique approach to high performance surfing, and I'm a big fan. My third winner coming out of the Western Australia Margaret River Pro is Jesse Miley Dyer, Renato Hickel, Kayla Durden, and the entirety of the commissioner's office. Now, this shouldn't shock anyone, but running these events, it's not an easy thing. It is a balance of weighing a multitude of opinions and agendas to put the very best surfing on display for all of us to enjoy. They're constantly talking to surfers, to locals, to event partners, to forecasters, and trying to figure out what is the best cadence. How are we putting on the best possible surfing at every event we go to? We've already talked about the tyranny of Easter today and how we didn't have the best forecast for Margaret River this year. But I would say that Jessie and her team, they navigated it almost flawlessly, and the reason I'm putting them in the winner box, right, is not just like, oh, good job, you did a good job with the forecast, but the point I want to make is their navigation of very, very difficult variables is what gets us a finals day like we had. It's what sets the conditions up for us to see what John can do, what Gabriella did, or Seth, or George, or Jack, and on and on and on. So, they're a huge part of us getting to enjoy the world's best surfing on the best platform possible. And hugely appreciative of that. And I think they nailed it in WA. So congrats and thank you.
I've thought about doing that job eventually. I'm like, oh, I could probably do that. It's like, but after this year, after the first five events, I'm like, I don't even want to be close to doing that eventually. Like, it's so stressful. As you said, you have to deal with everybody. And not just dealing with them, getting texts, calls, messages all the time. So you have to put up with the surfers, with the judges, with the staff, and of course, the hardest one of them all, the fans. So being able to have enemies right there and then have the forecast too and look at the ocean, every single minute of the day, that is the most difficult task out of everybody at the event. So props to them. Really pleased with the outcome, obviously. But it was a challenging one, and I hope that we are able to see this period shift a little bit later in the window, I would say, Dave, especially for Bells too. I think coming out of Easter would be a little bit more beneficial, even earlier. But eventually, I do think that there is going to need to be a change in order for us to get more consistent waves throughout a 14-day window.
It's a good point. And Easter in 2025 is 3.5 weeks later, right? It's April 20th. So we're already set up for better success in terms of seasonal wave quality. Doesn't always guarantee it. It's the ocean. We know that. But anyway, I just think the Western Australia Margaret River Pro was such an important event this season, and it delivered in a huge way, both in and out of the water. The stories were incredible, and I can't wait to see what happens the rest of the year. We're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Vissla CT Shaper rankings. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. All right, we are back. This is the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan here with my co-host, Mitch Salazar. It's time for the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings update. Shaper ranking! Background. This is our second full season of determining who the best surfboard shaper in the world is. Shapers are given points based on the performance of their surfers on boards that finish in the quarterfinals or better of the Championship Tour events. It's combined rankings, both men's and women's, so the higher the surfer places, the more points that shaper receives. We are tracking the Vissla CT Shaper rankings from Event 1 through the end of the regular season to crown a winner before the WSL Finals. So, when the dust had settled on the Vissla CT Shaper rankings post Western Australia Margaret River Pro, it was Matt Biolas and Lost Surfboards consolidating their position as number one on the rankings. WA did deliver one of the more spread out performances of the season. We had 10 shapers collecting results out of 16 places, but with Lost Surfboards grabbing both women's finalists, and a men's fifth, it really separated them from the pack of the other competitors in their tier. And by that, I mean shaping programs that have a similar number of team riders on their program really failed to grab results at the same pace as Lost in WA.
Yeah.
And with 4 events to go, it'll be interesting to see if anyone can catch up. Now, of course, a ton can change event to event. It's about 20,000-ish points between first and second right now. We can see a run at any of these stops moving forward, but Lost is in a great position. Mitch, what did you notice from a shaping and surfboard perspective out in WA?
Well, obviously, the main thing, Paizel still work as great as always. But, as we touched on in our previous 2 episodes, how well with boards with Hawaiian shapers and Hawaiian models translate to the Western Australia region. They did well. I mean, look at TNC. Sally Fitzgibbons had a couple amazing heats out there. Brisa Hennessy makes it to the finals in her 3rd or 4th appearance so far this year, which is just outstanding, by the way. But I really want to point out that Mayhem, too, has made some major improvements when it comes to his boards, especially for waves like this. Driver 3.0 on the smaller days, you're probably using the Subdriver 2.0, which is a really good groveler board, or just high-performance shortboard that you can ride in anything. And then, of course, we have JS, who had a couple of great heats, but eventually lost out with both Sam and Miguel, and then also Fred Moraes. But boards that look good with Ramsey Bukim, of course. Really like his style on those kind of waves. But once again, nearly 20,000 points separating first and second. And then you go second and third, more than 37,000 points separating Sharp Eye and Channel, or just under 37,000 points. That's a big difference right there. So to me, both Channel and Paizel, they have a lot of catching up to do. You want to see John in more finals over the course of the year. But I think it's going to be Sharp Eye Mayhem really going 1-2 in terms of the outcome of the season. And they have great surfers, especially in the back end of the year, where a lot of them have had major success too. We've talked about Kanoe Igarashi, how consistent he is. He's looked good for Sharp Eye so far this year. But to me, Mayhem, having both Griff, Gabby, Caroline in that kind of conversation of world champion once again. Joanne DeFay didn't necessarily have a good result here, but she's also doing great for Sharp Eye. Big props again to Jake Marshall. I mean, makes it to the round of 16, loses in the last few minutes to Imai DeVault. He's also a great rider for Sharp Eye. I think he's going to have an excellent back end of the year. And of course, Jack Robinson, major proponent for Sharp Eye, but he wasn't riding that on finals day. So to me, that's a major difference in the points they accumulated too, Dave.
Let's talk about that. I'm glad you brought Jack up, because that was going to be my next topic. Incredible performance from Jack Robinson at home in WA. We've talked about it in the past, right? Like home wave, hometown advantage on the CT. It's pretty polarizing. Like it's not a lot of like middle of the road results. It either the pressure melts you down, you underperform, and you're so disappointed in yourself, or you ride that support and momentum to a huge finish, as Jack has done not just once but twice in WA. Jack, he's been on the podcast a few times. We mentioned he's a friend of the pod. I think we've got a 4th episode with him coming out in the next few weeks. But he's been very transparent about his relationship with his shapers for years coming up. He rode Arakawas. He said, Eric is like his uncle. It's a family situation. They trust each other implicitly. As he was sharpening his performance surfing, outside of Waves of Consequence, he connected with Brendan Leckie and the Sharp Eye team. And the improvement we've seen from Jack in smaller waves, in more high performance waves, airs, turns, combinations on that Sharp Eye equipment has been incredible. But he still is open to working with Arakawa when he feels it necessary. And he did the entire finals day. Mitch, talk to me a little bit about why you think Jack made that decision on finals day. What about those Arakawas that maybe made him more comfortable in those conditions compared to the Sharp Eyes? It obviously worked, but that's 10,000 points that went to Arakawa that could have gone to Sharp Eye on the Vissla CT Shaper rankings. Not that Jack's focused on that part of the component, like he's there for his rankings, for his results to win a world title, but those decisions have an impact. What do you make of his decision to ride Arakawas on the final day?
Well, I'm even laughing before I even say that. Mars is gonna hate us after this episode. I can tell you. But it just comes down to feeling, and as you said, comfort. You look at Jack Robinson, his success in major waves, Sunset, multiple-time champion there, one on the Challenger Series, one on the Championship Tour, two-time champion here at home at WA. It comes down to the equipment that you're riding in those sets of days when you're free surfing too. And it just seems like he had one of those feelings with the sport on finals day, and he never switched it up either. Like, that was the board he rode throughout every single round during that day in Margaret River. Another thing I will say too, how about that drastic difference that a lot of surfers had to go through competing in 3 to 4 foot waves to 8-10 foot faces at least on finals day over there in MR2, especially the women, because there were certain surfers that went and surfed Southside in the round of 16, the last 4 heats over there, and then they transitioned to huge MR afterwards, main break. Like, that's a big difference. So to me, Jack Robinson riding Garrick's boards on finals day just proved a point that you want to be able to ride something that you know is going to work. And it just seemed like that was the board that was working for him in those types of conditions, especially the guy who knows the wave better than anybody else in competition. Like, you're going to trust what that guy's intuition is like, Dave.
It's a great point. And looking at the back half of the CT calendar, right, where we've got Tahiti next, we've got El Salvador, we've got Saquarema, and we've got Fiji. One could argue on paper that 2 out of those 4 events being heavier water critical waves, someone like Jack may elect to stick with Arakawas at 2 major events. That said, let's give Sharp Eye their flowers. He won Tahiti last year on a Sharp Eye, right? So it'll be interesting to see and see what he ends up riding. But I mean, a huge win for Jack, a huge win for Arakawa. And let's face it, Sharp Eye have an incredible team. We're going to be celebrating them very, very soon, I'm sure. They continue to deliver amazing performances. Seth Moniz' surfing has been transformed on those boards, and he had an incredible event. So really interesting. I teased this in our opening winners and losers segment, but I want to dive a little bit deeper on this. We talked about in 2017, John Florence and the Paizel Ghost model made their debut at serious waves at Main Break at Margaret River, and essentially transformed what everyone thought was possible in surfing. Question to you, Mitch. How much, if anything, has changed to your eye on the Ghost model, on John's approach, at a venue like Main Break since 2017?
I'd probably say maybe percentage-wise, less than 10%. I mean, maybe a little bit more rocker, maybe a little bit of more pulled in tail, but overall, it seems like the board just has major success out there because it kind of replicates what you're seeing both at the Sunset West Bowl and a lot of those breaks that you have on that 7-mile stretch on the North Shore too. If you've ever surfed Pupukea right there on the North Shore, right next to Eokai Beach Park, it's a wave that kind of breaks on the outside when it's big too, kind of lets you roll in, and eventually it really doubles up on the inside. Same thing for Haleiwa. I think the major change right here is the difference of fins that a lot of these surfers are using when it's smaller to when it's bigger. I actually brought a couple of fins to explain it too.
Ooh.
So this is John's, this is the model that he usually rides. It's his original one. It's a Tech Flex model from Future Fins. Rad Futures, by the way, they work great. This is something that I'd be riding over there at Margaret River on a day like that. So has a good flex pattern. Not super stiff. It's something that's really balanced, but as you can see, the outline too doesn't have a ton of rake. But most importantly, it's a really good fin for speed control too. So this is something that I'd be riding on some wave that really has a good amount of push. And we saw that on finals day over there at Margaret River. Now, on the FCS side, who did we have from FCS? George Bitar, I think, is one of them too. He's riding something like this. Mick Fanning model. This is a really good balance model. If I'm riding FCS fins, this is the template that I'd probably be riding. Really large outline. These are the Mick Fanning larges. And as you can see, good base too, really flat, but not a whole ton of flex either. So they're just a bit stiffer. But this is something that a power surfer would be riding out there. Drawing bigger lines, something that really holds off of the bottom too. And I really like the amount of fins that we're seeing a lot of surfers ride in different kinds of conditions too. To me, that's a major difference that we've seen 80s, 90s into the 2000s and 2020s now, because having glass on fins before I thought was great. Certain waves required it. They're a lot more controlled. But in terms of traveling one, is huge because you're able to actually take them off. But most importantly, you can ride different fins with the same board in different kinds of conditions. So that to me is the major proponent right now that we're seeing from both boards and fin selection. We saw that a lot during this waiting period, obviously. It went from being really small, strong offshore, something that you really needed a lot of flex on the bottom turn just to be able to get some release into the lip. And going back to the Ghost model, that's a model that's really going to work when it's 4 feet plus here at Margaret River. He was riding a Red Tiger most of the days, actually, up until finals day, which is the newer model. It's a better version of the Ghost, essentially. But that's something that you could ride when it's a bit smaller there at main break.
That's interesting. And the visual aids, Mitch, I have to say, that's going to juice our YouTube numbers.
Yeah.
Just like to listen to us. So well done to you. One last question on the Ghost model for civilians like myself. Your colleague on the broadcast, Richie Lovett, longtime CT superstar, winner of the Trestle CT in 2003, big time, beat Taj Burrow. He had a great moment on the broadcast where he was breaking down John's backup board while John was in the heat. And he was profuse in saying how different that template was to what pretty much everyone else is riding.
Yeah.
Like wider points a little bit forward, some interesting things with the concaves and the contours underneath the board. But Mitch, to the civilian eye, if you lined up all the boards, you'd be like, well, they all look pretty similar. But what is it about the Ghost model that seems so radically different at the elite level compared to other equipment?
Well, as you said, the front part of the board just has more paddling power. So the majority of the volume is usually going to be in the chest moving forward. So it's really just for you to get into the wave. The performance side of it is the tail does a lot more pulled in, which is going to allow for better release, but more control off of the pivot off of the bottom too. So essentially, that's going to be a board that doesn't necessarily have, a lot of drag, but most importantly, it's going to be able to surf really free when you're coming off of the bottom too. A wider tail, like somebody larger like myself usually has to ride because I'm a bigger boy, needs a little bit more volume towards the tail end of the board, Dave. John's around 180, 185, you would say, 6'2". He's usually riding something with a pulled in tail like we saw with the Ghost model there that really allows some control off of the bottom, and it never slides out. So you combo that with some great fins like we saw right here, the Tech Flex John from Futures. Those are a great combination to see what we saw, especially on that 10-point ride. Great control off of the bottom, but a good amount of release once you make it into the lip. I'm a huge fan of the Ghost model. I do think it is a board, though, that you do want to ride on better waves. So for a lot of our listeners, if you're in Southern California, I'd probably be looking at a Paisalian, something like that standards from Paisel. But if you're surfing great waves, imagine lower trestles on a pumping bay. That's easily something you could be riding out there. But it looked fantastic under John's feet. And as you said, Richie Lovett, he does an amazing job with the board breakdown, just like Peter Mel does. But I think what Richie also broke down too were the use of the fins. I thought it was essential to prove that on finals day too, because there were a lot of major fin changes going into that day in comparison to the previous ones.
I love it. Thanks for that breakdown, Mitch. And on the topic of unique equipment, I want to touch on Kelly Slater riding a 2+1.
He heard us. He heard us.
I know. Well, he half heard us, right? Because I had to do a double take and it was like hassling our broadcast team to be like, get a close up of what he took out because, Waxhead on the broadcast, I think I was in and out of the room and he said, yeah, Kelly's out there riding a 2+1 setup. And I went, oh, okay. I figured he'd be riding, I believe it's like the Great White Twin, like a performance twin. I believe Mike Wu shapes it for Slater Designs. They've put out an edit. It looks awesome. And as you pointed out, the conditions were smaller. We were like, someone like him could draw different lines and still be surfing at an elite level. This is going to be awesome. And then when they showed a close-up of the board, it wasn't a performance fish, but it was more of a thruster shape with the 2+1 setup. And what I mean by that for the listeners, it's sort of a two almost twin fin size fins on the side with a smaller thruster in the middle. So we call that like a 2+1. Mm-hmm. Mitch, what's the thinking behind putting that kind of a fin setup in a thruster template board compared to a performance fish like the Great White from Mike Wu?
That is an excellent question, though, because it's not like the board is an actual twin fin. It's a short board. Mm-hmm. I was actually taken off guard. But once again, as we pointed out many times before, if somebody's going to prove anybody wrong and just prove that something works, it's going to be the all-time great. I thought it looked fun, actually. He made that heat, so it obviously worked. But I don't necessarily agree with the fact that like you should be taking out that kind of fin setup with a thruster. To me, you can ride a thruster setup in a twin fin, though, if the fins are large enough. If it has enough hold, I could see that happening, not the other way around. It looked good, though. I'm not going to lie. I thought it looked good. It had a good amount of release. But I think the idea of it was just, it was a little bit smaller waves, non-priority heat. You're probably looking at those inside waves where you really need to generate a lot of speed. And I think that was the base around it. Like, he just wanted to be able to draw a little bit of a different line on a smaller wave with some larger fins. So it was really cool. I thought it worked. And hopefully he can maybe translate that model into an eventual twin fin or 2+1 setup for the public. But, they just dropped the S-Boss. That's a great shortboard. They have another.
I think just on that note, I think we were trying to figure it out. We should have looked this up a little bit more, but it looked like David Silva, who's another Slater Designs team rider,
texted me that
maybe rode the S-Boss in his one of the opening round or elimination round heats. He looked great on his backhand, but the board he was riding certainly looked like it had a much fuller, kind of stubbier nose.
Right.
I don't think we confirmed it, but I mean, geez, both with Kelly and David and a few others, so much on the line in WA, and they're thinking a little bit more freely about their equipment choice. They're not so conservative and like, oh, this stakes are here. I've got to be on my Ferrari, right?
Well, how do you stand out nowadays, Dave? I mean, we mentioned
point.
it in the last episode. I think the only way to do something different is by being a little bit different with your outside thinking, and it's obviously worked for Kelly before. That one heat that he had at Pipe in 2008 against Timmy, then eventually beat Chris Ward in the finals too. That was a step down. It was a really short
deep
board.
Six.
Yeah. It was huge that day too. I mean, backdoor was firing. Was able to get a 10 and a 9 in a matter of minutes over there. And then eventually he transitioned. Remember those boards that Stu Kennedy was riding for a long time too? He was riding those for a good amount of time. And it's just creative thinking outside of the box. And eventually you might need to be able to do that in order to be successful and win a world championship.
Since we talked about it being the bookend on Kelly's 35-year full-time stint as a CT competitor, who on the tour, men and women moving forward, do you think is going to fill that void of in-heat experimentation with equipment?
It's a pretty damn good question. Because
there's an element of psychology to it, right? Like,
right?
You want to. I would be shocked if someone who hasn't accomplished things but has the potential starts experimenting, because I think you take a more conservative approach, being like, no, I want to be consistent and I want to win world titles. Mm-hmm. You almost have to look at the class of surfers who have achieved quite a lot and still want to perform at a high level. And I don't want to say they're bored with traditional equipment, but they want to feel something different. They want to explore something different. I think Steph coming back in 2025 is probably my pick if I had to pick one of either the men or the women. But do you have someone else that you could see doing it in future? I
actually just thought about it, and he won his first world championship on a Dark Arts carbon board from Sharp Eye.
Great one.
It was a quad, too, and it's Felipe Toledo. And
that's perfect.
We're not going to see him in the rest of the year, but we're going to see him compete in 2025. When he did that in 21, I actually picked him to win the world championship the first year we had the finals. Made it into the final matches against Gabe. They were really competitive, but he was riding that same board there that first year. It was a quad. I think it was a 77 by Sharp Eye in a Dark Arts construction. So a little bit stiffer board, but it's not an epoxy. So it allows that poly to really release, not have that much balance if it's a little bit larger too. I think that's why it resulted in being such a good board the first year when it was a bit bigger. And then he rode it on the smaller year when he eventually defeated Italo at lowers when it was way smaller, but just as drivey as we saw the year before too. And it was a quad setup, which to me was the most interesting part about it. Not necessarily that it was a carbon board, that you're using something with a lot more control and not a ton of release. But obviously, we're talking about a guy who's already won 2 world championships, so it worked. But I think Felipe's style does kind of have that point where Kelly did in the peak of his career, where he kind of hits the lip, drives a little bit off of it, and gains more speed down the line. I wouldn't be surprised to see him ride a 2+1 setup eventually at certain point breaks. I think J-Bay's one potential spot if we were able to return there on the championship tour. And I think Punta Roca is going to be another one too, because if that wave's a little bit smaller, you do want more drive down the line, and speed is your friend there at those locations.
It's a great pick. And Felipe is also someone who, even when he was younger, was happy to kind of zig when everyone else was zagging. Like, I think it was 2013, the Oakley Pro Bali. He was riding a quad Firewire board when everyone was very focused on their traditional thruster setup. So great pick. Before we close out of our Vissla CT Shaper ranking segment, we've talked about this since last season, right? The way we work this ranking out is a celebration of all the hard work that not just the shapers, but their glassers, their sanders, their distributors, everyone that elevates the performances of the world's best surfers with the world's best surfboard programs. A lot of work goes into it. And it's never been apples to apples, and we've never pretended it is, right? There are different programs, and we've kind of bucketed them into three tiers. There's the top tier with the bigger programs that certainly have an advantage in the rankings because they've got more surfers. But the reason we wanted to program the rankings the way we did is we did not want to discount surfer choice. That surfers are choosing to go to these programs, and that means something. There's a middle tier, right, that's got 3 or 4 surfers on the program, and then there's another tier where there's maybe 1, maybe 2 surfers on a program. The relegation line has a huge impact on this. And I'm just going to list off the programs who lost surfers at relegation. And I want to get your take on maybe who suffered the worst blow out of the relegated surfers. So JS Industries, who's come back in a big way in 2024. They've got awesome surfers on tour. Ramsey Bukayan, Ryan Callanan. They had the Pupo brothers and Frederico Moraes. Unfortunately for them, both the Pupo brothers and Frederico have been relegated to the Challenger Series. Lost 2023 Rookie of the Year, Ian Gentile, and one of my favorite surfers on tour, Cade Matson and Eli Hanneman. Rusty lost Kyle Belly. DHD lost Jacob Wilcox, Callum Robson, and Isabella Nichols. Slater Designs lost both Kelly Slater and David Silva. Channel Islands lost Lakey Peterson and Alyssa Spencer. Sharp Eye lost Luana Silva. TNC Surf lost Sally Fitzgibbons. And Paizel lost both India Robinson and Sophie McCulloch. So if we're looking at the surfers who fell off tour and the impact that made on the programs competing to become CT Shaper of the Year, Mitch, who do you think suffered the worst loss in WA?
I was going to say JS, but the immediate answer is DHD. They don't have a ton of men or women left. Molly is the only surfer that did it on the female side. And then you look at the men now, obviously Ethan Ewing, he's going to have more success throughout the year. You have Liam O'Brien, who's currently in the top 10. He's had a sneaky good year, by the way.
Awesome year for Liam. Yeah.
Props to Law, man. I mean, he's been surfing his heart out, really consistent too. And they also have Connor O'Leary, but he's down in 21. So the reason I say it mainly is because DH, at a certain point last year in our inaugural Vissla CT Shaper rankings, was a top-tier shaper, but most importantly, he was leading too.
Yeah.
He's had a major drop, and that's why I consider this to be the biggest loss. To me, he was a bit more competitive before, and I'm not saying that he's not right now, but the surfers need to get results too in order for him to be able to compete with the top 3 spots.
It's a great one. I mean, especially considering when you're looking at the 3 surfers from the DH program that are now relegated to the Challenger Series, both Callum and Isabella have historically gotten results for DHD. And Jacob Wilcox, for my money, was one of the best rookie prospects we had coming into the year. I think a little bit more seasoning with him, a little bit more maturity, he'll be able to weather some of those tougher heats. But that kid's ceiling, to me, is super high. If he sticks with it. So I think you're right. I think DHD was poised to make a real run at the CT Shaper of the Year title this year. He suffered a tough loss, but hey, anything can happen. We can see some movement on the teams at any day, obviously. But I'm interested to see how the back 4 events go and to see what's going to happen on the 2024 Vissla CT Shaper rankings. We're going to take one more break to get a word in from our sponsors. And when we come back, we will wrap it up with some listener questions.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Lineup Podcast. I'm your part-time co-host, Mitchell Salazar, here with the Chief Strategy Officer of the World Surf League, David Prodan. Remember, if we don't get to your question in today's listener question segment, we'll do our best to respond in our direct messages, as we always do. So our favorite segment of the pod, Dave, listening to our fans. And of course, we got some great questions as always. And our first question is actually from a couple of kids that I know here from the Southern California area. Two great surfers, at Logan_and_Marlo Harris. Has there ever been such a dramatic change of guards as in this season?
That's a great question. And obviously, we've been talking about it this year. I'm trying to factor in the recency bias, but to me, men's and women's, I don't think, as long as I've been working on tour, which is almost 2 decades now, we've seen it. And we've seen what we were talking about last time, right? It's not just that young surfers are coming onto the tour. They're coming on, and the likelihood that they're making traditional rookie mistakes is so much lower than in the past. They're coming on so well prepared. Their fitness is dialed in, their equipment is dialed in, their heat strategy is dialed in, their ability in all kinds of waves is dialed in. And I think that's really contributing to like a comprehensive changing the guards on the men's and women's seasons. I think in the last few years, probably on the women's side, we've seen, Katie, Molly. So it's not so much just this season, but I think over the last couple of years, we've seen them lead the charge for the turnover. But as we've been talking about this podcast, Gabriella Bryan, second year on tour, wins her first CT event. Alyssa Spencer, rookie on tour. She's in the final. Great proof points there. And then on the men's side, we've sort of talked about it quite a lot. Like there's this emerging class of title contender coming up under what I would consider surfers that are still in their prime, but established surfers like Felipe, John, Gabriel, Italo, all world champions that could easily still win the world title. But you've got this cool tension there. And just thinking back, I'm trying to think, probably the two that really come to mind would be the Jordy Dane rookie season on tour, which is in 2008. But that was certainly not like a results-driven dramatic shift. It was more like a surfing approach dramatic shift, more than what we're seeing this year. And then probably the more profound shift, and this is a little bit before my time, but it was the ascension of the Cooley kids, Mick, Parko, and Dean in the early 2000s. And I remember there was this great story by Sean Doherty in Tracks way back when, 2001 or 2002, around then. And he was commenting on the Bells event. And it was one of those Bells event. I'm sure Easter was earlier in the year. They had to go down to Joanna because the forecast was so bad. And at the time, Sonny Garcia, who was a world champion, and Luke Egan, who was a title contender, I think they were involved in the surfer rep conversations on, do we run? Where do we run? Like, who's going to be on? What's the heat kind of schedule for the day going to look like? And Sean's writing the story, and he said they all pull up on the hill at Joanna, and there's 3 back-to-back waves that happen. And the first one is Mick Fanning, and he tears this Rip Bull apart, this right-hander. And he's looking at it and he goes, well, that's going to be like an 8.5 or something, and right behind him is Joel Parkinson. You got to remember, they're all really young and they're rookies at this point. And Joel gets barreled and does the Joel thing for the rest of the wave. And Sean's going, that's even better. That's like a 9.5. And then Dingo gets the third wave and he just gets drained all the way down the bank. And he goes, that's a 10, and the contest director and Sonny Garcia and Luke Egan and the other surfers that were on tour, according to the story, they called the contest off. They went, nah, it's too much rip. It's not good. The wind's going to get bad. And Sean's like, the world changed today. Like, the world changed because they were aware, and these 3 surfers knew it, and I would say that's probably, if you had to look over the arc of history, the last time we saw such a dramatic change. But that too, right? I don't think it was as results driven as we're seeing now. But I don't know. You're so much closer to this too, Mitch, and you've actually competed too at a very high level. So what do you think about this question?
Well, there's 2 generations that come to mind. Well, first of all, on the women's side, I'd have to say when Lakey, Tati, and Joanne, trying to think of who else was in that kind of class. Tyler was maybe a few years before. Like when they all kind of made the push for the top 5, top 10, we saw it on the women's side. On the men's side, we saw that generation of both Jordy and Dane you were talking about, but it was more the approach. Like they brought much more progression into it. As you said, it wasn't really the competitive side of it. Jordy was a QS champion, yes. He was competitive as hell, but we know that. I mean, that's been happening for 17 years now on both the QS and the Championship Tour. There's 2 generations on the men's side that I would say have really played a pivotal part in both my life and my surfing career. One is, I think it was the 09 class, Dusty, Owen, and Julian Wilson qualified. And that's kind of when I was like, okay, like the younger guys are taking over eventually. And then, of course, you see the early 2010s, to mid, Brazilian Storm. You see John. Like, those guys eventually shifted it. But the big difference to me now, and they had success on the QS and the major events. Then they eventually were able to find success in year 2, 3, 4 eventually. To me now, though, the biggest difference is the amount of experience that they're having at major events, though. Look at the Challenger Series. Like, and the way the system is formatted now is just so much more beneficial, too. Like, you already have a spot secured in the Challengers. You don't have to balance both things out. Like, it's so much easier just to be able to focus on one thing rather than both at the same time. And I think that's why we're seeing this generation really pivot and increment their chances of winning the World Championship within their first, second, or third year. I mean, look at Lakey Peterson. Like, she was on the Championship Tour for a long time. Like, she just got relegated to a rookie who dropped the highest score of the event in the semifinals, made it to the final 2 in a crucial part of the year for her. On the men's side, I was with you. I thought Jacob Wilcox was going to be one of those key guys to really implement a good rookie class this year. Turns out that Crosby Colapinto's had a fantastic year, very consistent, and Cole Hashman got his first win as a rookie too. So just overall, not only a generational shift, but more importantly, they're competitive. And not that we hadn't seen that with Dusty, Julian, and those guys. I just don't think that quick. Like Gabe in the mid-year that he surfed in 2011, yes, he does win 2 events. But we're talking about one of the guys that's up there for GOATs, So
he's more of an outlier than like a part of a generational shift. It's a great question, though. Thanks for the question, guys.
Yeah, and both Logan and Marlo, they're rippers here from SoCal, so shout out to them. Our second question, another fun one too, and I think this is one that we saw kind of highlight itself at Margaret River. Dave, it's from @IamNewintown. Will John ever win another CT event, and what will it take?
Nah, John's washed. Nah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, as we talked about, there's been this very vocal and very demonstrable changing of the guard. John's a 2-time world champion, but I think talking to his camp offline and even getting the reports on broadcast, which have been great, this is the fittest John's been, maybe ever, but certainly in several years. It's the most motivated he's been in a long time, and it's absolutely showing up in the performances. And he's been pretty candid about it too, even though he's not a man of many, many words. But he's like, oh, motivation's a thing. When the waves are like that, like, I'm motivated because I want to see what I can do. But he's a very competitive guy too. And I think what people forget sometimes is he's had a number of years with injury, right? Over the last few years, or coming back from injury or nursing injury or whatever it's been. I think it's only a matter of time before we see him win another CT event. It might just be a week, by the time this thing comes out, a couple of weeks, I guess. But the point being is that I think he absolutely can win almost any CT event on tour still. I think he is motivated to win more world titles, to win more CT events. I think as we saw in Margaret River, the performances are 100% there, but they're not unbeatable. Any surfer on tour can rise to the occasion. And we saw someone like Jack Robinson, who we didn't talk about a lot in this podcast, to be fair, but like incredible surfing from Jack Robinson this season. Incredible power and like strength of mind, really, with everything that's happening in his personal life, new fatherhood, etc. He's harnessing all these things, and he seems incredible. So my point being, yeah, I think John's going to win a number of CT events before he's done, and maybe even a few more world titles. But I don't know, Mitch, what do you think?
No, I think it's a big yes on my behalf too. It's a solid question though, and the reason why I think it's really interesting that he brought it up is because he hasn't won an event in 3 years. He's made finals, but he hasn't won.
Right.
He's been consistent, but as you said, and I don't. Where's wood? Like I need to knock on it right now. I don't want to jinx it, but it is the healthiest we've seen him in years, and the World Tour is better when John's healthy. Like he not only pushes everybody else to do better, but even his own performances too. I mean, how many great results did we see right there in Margaret River on finals day? Heat against Sam, the semifinal where he dropped a 10. And I'm trying, again, not to curse, but that messed up turn on the 8.4 to me was the highlight of the event. I mean, you get an excellent score just based off of one event. And it's the creativity, it's the different lines. And that's why he's been so successful at Margaret River before. And to bring up Jack Robinson, he deserves his praise and his flowers too. The only way he beat John in the final was by being just a bit different, and he never tried to compete with John in what John was good at. I mean, He had his 9, but then under priority catches the 8 with a nice single air and then finishes that wave off. So it was something that we hadn't seen up until that point. And what did it do? It forced John to get his best score, the 8.77, and pull a Hail Mary air in the last section, too, which easily could have been the best score of the heat, too. But to me, John, most complete surfer on the World Championship Tour. I think him and Gabe are anomalies. They're two of the greatest generational surfers that we're ever going to see. And they've changed the sport in a very positive and enthusiastic way for the rest of professional surfers to come up after them. I think the strength of schedule on the back end is huge for him, too. He's had incredible results in Fiji. We've seen him make finals in Tahiti. I think it's going to be a good back end of the year for John. We could potentially see his first win, and I picked him to win the World Championship, so I'd like to see him at lower trestles. To conclude our segment, Dave, our final question, at Lewis to BRNDY, I would think it's Brandy. Do you think that top 5 is settled, or do you expect big changes?
Ooh, that's a spicy question. I mean, I'd say this: the opportunity for change is so much higher than the opportunity for stagnation. Right? We've got 4 more CT events. That's 40,000 potential points if you win all 4 of them. And if you're looking at the current top 5 now, the top spots on each side are hovering in the mid 20,000s to upper 20,000 space. That said, if you look at both the fields, like I could easily see these being the fields at the finals. On the men's side, you've got Griffin Colapinto, Jack Robinson, John Florence, Ethan Ewing, and Jordy Smith. Now, the disgusting fact of no goofy footers on the men's side in the top 5 notwithstanding.
Heartbreak.
That is a murderer's row of talent on the men's side in the top 5 right now. And if that was the group that went to lower trestles, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Similarly, on the women's side, Katie Simmers, Joanne DeFay, Molly Picklum, Brisa Hennessy, and Gabby Bryan. Like, if that was the 5 that went to the finals, I wouldn't be shocked at all. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Mitch, not only to answer the question,
again,
but if you had to pick one men and woman to fall out of the current top 5 before the end of the year, yep, we're doing this. Who do you pick, and who do you think in the field? And you can give me a couple candidates of who you think in the field could potentially fill that spot. Who you got? I'll go too, but I just want to hear you go first.
Dude, on the women's side, I just think Caroline is going to make it there. I don't see how she doesn't. She won Tahiti last year, won Punta Roca. So those are 2 events where she could easily defend her title at. I think she's going to be
6th right now, right? So she's right there.
Just outside.
Who do you think she's going to take?
I'd say Gabby. Not to say that Gabby is not capable of doing it, but now you have to defeat those people that are seated above you in every event to conclude the year. So are you going to be able to maintain that consistency in those quarter semis and even the final 2 to break into a top 2, top 3 seeding, whereas Caroline's done that before. And once again, Caroline's only 22. Gabby just turned 22. They're the same age. But the big difference is that Caroline's already been on tour for 6 years. The experience is there. This is Gabby's 3rd year. don't hate me, Gabby. I know you're a lineup team rider too. I just don't know if she's going to be able to maintain that consistency because look at Brisa so far. Her 4 counting results are semifinals.
It's crazy.
She's having the best year of her career so far. Molly, it's just a matter of time before she just eventually flips the switch. I don't see Joanne getting knocked out, and Caitlin Simmers to me is probably going to win another event too. So let's start with the women.
Yeah,
who do you have on the women's side?
That I was going to say, I agree. Unofficial lineup podcast team notwithstanding. I hope I'm wrong. Like I think Gabby winning was a long time coming, and I think she can absolutely do it at these back 4 events throughout the remainder of the year. But I do think if anyone on that top 5 right now, just the youth and I mean, geez, the women surfers outside the top 5 are really scary. Caroline Marks, Betty Lou Sakura-Johnson, Tyler Wright, Tatiana Weston-Webb, and Sawyer Lindblad. I think you're right. I think Caroline's probably the most likely one to move into the top 5, but that is a scary group of folks that are looking to break in over the back 4 events of the season. What about on the men's side? Because I actually think this is a harder pick for me personally to be like, this person's probably going to fall out, if anyone, and then this person's going to come in. But what are you looking at?
Well, main thing that stands out is that there's a big separation between 4th and 5th right now. Ethan Ewing, 20,610 points. Jordy Smith, 16,905. So around 4,000 points. And then you go below that, it's really close between the number 5 surfer all the way to number 10. 2,000 points roughly separating those 5 guys. The main factor, though, is Gabe. And he can just go on a tear where he wins 2-3 events in a row. Not only does that, but makes finals days in every single of those 4 events that are remaining. It's not impossible, and it's happened before. Remember Italo in 2019. He went on a roll. He made 3 finals in a row right there at the end. One in Super Tools, had just finaled against Jeremy in France, and then eventually defeated Gabriel Medina, who was number 2 in the world. Number 1 and 2 faced off in the final, and he won his first and only world championship. To me, he's the big X factor. Top 10 is crazy. You have Jake Marshall in there. You have Barron, who I still think is a contender. Cole, Kanoa, who's extremely consistent and a smart competitor. Lob at number 10. But if Gabe is able to get on a roll, I'd say watch out. Now, who would he knock out? Oh, my God. I want Jordy to make the finals. Like, I want him to compete for a world championship. But can he have that consistency at 2 spots that have kind of been his Achilles heel? He's done okay in Tahiti, but I wouldn't say that Fiji is necessarily his strong point. And it's a bummer that that's the last event of the year, too, because that's going to be a result that's really dependent of his own surfing. But the 2 middle events, he's won in Rio, and he's also done super well at Punta Roca. So that's the big X factor. Can Jordy maintain a top 5 spot heading into the last 4 events?
Yeah, a similar opinion on my side. And I think that what we saw earlier in this year, and almost in a similar situation to John, is I think people forget how good Jordy is almost everywhere. But he has gone through a few seasons with injuries. He's had a lot of stuff happen, good stuff, but like personal life stuff, fatherhood and all that. And he's been on tour for a while. He's accomplished a lot. So the motivation question with him is always going to be there, as it would for any surfer, man or woman in his situation. But I think you're right. I think that separation between the top 4 and number 5 right now of about 4,000 points, and Tahiti and Fiji being on the calendar make Jordy the most likely person. That said, I would say that different to the women's field outside of the top 5, there's not any immediate person that stands out to me that that person's going to come in. Obviously, any of them could do it. They're all very talented. You mentioned Kanoa Igarashi. I think he's great everywhere. He's a former Final 5 surfer, but world champs that are currently outside the top 5, or even Final 5 competitors that are currently outside the Final 5. The first one outside of Kanoa, it's 2019 world champion Italo Ferreira at 16th, and then Gabriel Medina at 19th. So they have a ton of ground to make up if they're going to do damage and get into the top 5. Another thing to consider on the men's side, there are no Brazilians in the current top 5. And if that maintains, it will be the first year since 2017 that a Brazilian didn't win the men's world title, which I think is remarkable.
There are no Brazilians in the top 10, by the way, which I think is kind of unbelievable given how much success they've had over the last decade and a half. But most importantly, the success of those two world champions, as you mentioned. And I think, not having Felipe here makes things different too.
Totally.
It's changed the seating, but yeah, you're talking about two of the most talented surfers ever. And in Gabe's defense, he's lost two very close heats the last back-to-back events. So, I mean, I'm not going to, pit that against him, but it's time. Statistically speaking, he's the best surfer ever in Tahiti, and we all know what he can do in Fiji too. He's won there.
Well, now that his ranking stock has dropped low enough, he might be a candidate to join the unofficial lineup podcast team. We should buy low on Gabe. But you bring up a great point, right? Because I think people will look at the rankings and again, astute followers of the sport may go, well, wow, the Brazilians have gotten worse. No. Everyone's gotten better than they were before. The Brazilians drove, that Brazilian storm of the 2000s drove so much motivation across the board, men's and women's from other countries, and people got organized and people got serious and people trained harder. And it's risen the floor of competency, of performance, of ability and competition so high that it's not a slam dunk anymore. I would say that Gabe's surfing better than he ever has. It's just that everyone is surfing so much better as well. And it's not a slam dunk anymore. So it's great for the sport. I'd love to see him go on a rampage because I think having him in the finals, we talked about it when I think you and I had our last episode, that Gabby John quote unquote rivalry that we've never quite got because, someone was always ascendant and someone was hobbled by injury or vice versa. I want to see that happen in our lifetime. And I think the finals are a good platform to see it. But, really good questions. Appreciate everyone that wrote in and at the lineup pod. If we didn't get to your question, hit us up. We'll try to answer it on DM as we always do. But Mitch, thanks, man. This was a juicy pod. There was a ton that happened, and there's a lot happening in the upcoming events. Make sure everyone tunes in to watch the start of the Challenger Series season on the Gold Coast with the Bonsoi Gold Coast Pro, and the world's best surfers will be back very soon in Tahiti for the Shiseido Tahiti Pro presented by Outerknown. Mitch, always a pleasure, buddy, and look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Yeah, and let's hope that Snapper turns on day for the first event of the season too.